You running through a white neighborhood or stealing something? A morning that should have been peaceful in a suburban Atlanta park turned into something else entirely. Maya Carter, an FBI special agent, was simply out for a jog, yet a thick-skinned white cop had the audacity to stop her, hurling insults at her like she was a thief, for no other reason than the color of her skin. What he didn't know was that just a few short minutes later, he would be face down on the grass, face shoved into the filthy truth of his own prejudice. The incident burned through the city like wildfire, tearing down the polite fiction of justice and exposing the rot beneath a system that allowed this garbage to thrive unchecked. When you're just a regular jogger and you're still seen as a criminal just because of your skin tone, what state are you really in? And more importantly, has this ever happened in your state? Maya Carter went for a run every morning. Not for her health and not out of any passion for fitness. It was her way of resetting her breath after long days at the FBI office in downtown Atlanta. She chose this park because it was tucked away from the busy commercial areas. Few people recognized her here, and most who did were too wrapped up in their own lives to care. This morning was no different. The sky was clear, with a light mist brushing over the grass. Maya wore black athletic pants and a fitted orange tank top, practical and unobtrusive, yet offering full freedom of movement. Her hair was tied back, her stride steady, her breathing controlled. She noticed a few familiar faces, the elderly couple with the golden retriever, the middle-aged man doing push-ups under the large oak tree. Everything followed the usual script until Maya felt a gaze fixed on her. Not too near, not too far. She didn't turn her head, but her heart rate rose slightly. Not because of the run. It was instinct. In her profession, instinct was often the only line between survival and failure. Maya had been at crime scenes that seemed calm until silence became final. Now, in this quiet park, something crawled beneath her skin. No sound of footsteps behind her. No car engine starting. Just that unmistakable sensation of being watched. She kept running but altered her path, taking a wider route toward the lake where there were fewer people and the sun filtered through changing leaves. She glanced at her watch. Still early. Usually she would speed up through this section before heading back. Today she stopped. She pretended to adjust her shoelaces, eyes drifting sideways without seeming to. At the end of the trail, about 40 meters away, a patrol car was parked just off the curb. Its lights were off. The windshield caught sunlight and cast a glare, darkening the inside. Maya could just make out a figure sitting still. No one stepped out, but the gaze did not break. She spent extra time tying her shoes. A breeze passed over her neck. A crow called in the distance, a sharp note that somehow punctuated the moment. She stood up, adjusted her earbuds, but did not press play. Her ears were more alert than her eyes now. Something in her coiled inward, like a spring under tension. She could not say what was coming, but it would not be easy. She resumed her path, more slowly now. Her breath remained even, but her heart had taken on its rhythm, and though no sound confirmed it, she knew the person in the car had opened the door. At the junction where two trails met, the white patrol car rested quietly as if recently shut off. The man inside did not attempt to look away. This was not a casual glance. It was the kind of look used to assess an object, not a person. Maya slowed her pace, bent again as if fixing Greg's shoelace. The officer's eyes stayed on her. Through the glare, she saw the name on his badge, Harding. Greg Harding stepped out of the car just as Maya rose to her feet. His right hand rested near his waist, close to his radio. It was an unconscious motion, but one that revealed a trained reflex. He spoke with a rough tone that carried control rather than curiosity. He asked if she was out for an early run. Maya nodded and replied yes. He said there had been reports of unfamiliar people in the area, and asked if she lived nearby. The question seemed harmless, but Maya knew its real meaning. She had encountered it before. When a black person appeared somewhere, silently marked as off-limits, someone always asked why. Maya replied that she was just running. Her tone was calm. She was not ready to reveal who she was. Not yet. Harding raised his eyebrows. He was not used to receiving a response without submission. He moved closer. His sunglasses slid slightly down his nose, revealing eyes that looked irritated, suspicious, and possibly something more. The morning air remained cool, but between them, the energy had shifted. Maya understood the peaceful run was over. She stood her ground. She did not look away, her feet planted firmly as if anchored in place. She had no intention of provoking, but she would not allow herself to show even a flicker of fear. She had learned long ago that fear permitted others to advance. He asked her name. His voice was even, but his step forward made the question feel like a command. She answered without flinching, stating that she was not obligated to provide her name without proper cause. Harding narrowed his eyes. Her confidence caught him off guard, if only for a second. Then he gave a short laugh that had no humor in it. He was shifting tactics, pushing the power dynamic further. He asked if she thought she was smart. She answered that she knew the law. Her voice stayed flat, but her words were solid. The space around them seemed to pause. A few joggers moved by, casting glances that vanished just as quickly. Maya recognized that kind of silence. It was the silence that let men like Greg operate without interruption. He stepped back half a pace, hand now resting near his radio. But Maya saw that he had not pressed the button. He told her that if she could not prove she lived nearby, he had the right to detain her for verification. His voice was cold and controlled, but his breathing had changed. She told him he was wrong. She said she knew her rights and she was not someone who folded under pressure. Greg's jaw tightened. He was not used to being confronted, especially not by a black woman. His eyes narrowed, his mouth drew tight, and for a brief moment, Maya saw it. He was not just angry, he was threatened. And when a certain kind of man feels threatened, he does not back off, he attacks. Maya understood this would not end with a conversation. Greg tilted his head, his eyes half skeptical, half mocking. He stepped forward, not in a rush, nor with noise, but just enough for Maya to feel the encroachment. It was a deliberate kind of step, like a predator stalking its prey. Silent, but with eyes locked onto the target. He didn't need to yell. His question came out clear enough to be understood without ambiguity. "What are you doing here?" In truth, he didn't need to ask. Greg posed the question to affirm that he was in control. The way he paused, scanning the woman in front of him from head to toe, made it clear he was evaluating something that didn't belong, like a foreign object that needed to be removed. Maya kept her face neutral. Her response was short, sufficient, and unyielding, that she was out jogging, as she had already said. No need to repeat it a third time, but she knew he wouldn't back down just because of an answer. Greg crossed his arms, a familiar stance for those who use physicality as a tool of dominance. He said there had been a string of burglaries in the western neighborhood, a flat-toned statement, yet every word carried implication. She looked like someone he was trying to frame. Maya didn't respond. Her years investigating civil rights cases had taught her overreacting would only compromise her stance. She remained still, shifting her weight slightly onto her left leg, ready, if necessary, to move. Not out of fear, but because she knew exactly what kind of man stood in front of her. Someone who had used authority as a weapon before. He continued, this time asking about ID, phone, wallet. The questions came faster now, his voice lower but still edged with mockery. Maya replied that she had her phone on her and calmly pointed out that he had no right to search her without a specific sign of violation. She didn't raise her voice. Her tone was gentle, almost like explaining the law to a trainee, but Greg heard every word, and each one scraped at his ego. He laughed, not out of amusement, but to brush off the sting. He asked if she studied law. It sounded like a taunt, but it was also a probe. Maya replied, almost, a deliberate answer. Not to boast, not to threaten, just enough to let him know she wasn't easily manipulated. And he started to realize that. Greg hesitated slightly. It wasn't clear whether out of surprise or discomfort, maybe both. Maya's posture, non-confrontational yet firm. Her gaze steady, not challenging but not avoiding either. That calmness rendered all his usual tactics useless. He was used to people who were either afraid or angry, but she stood there like a mirror held up to him, and that was what began to threaten Greg Harding. Not muscle or weapons, but something he rarely faced. Quiet confidence without a facade. The silence between Maya and Greg lasted only a few seconds, but in that space, every detail seemed magnified. It wasn't passive silence. It was a kind of subtle standoff, where each waited for the other to make the first slip. Greg broke it, not out of impatience, but because he needed to reclaim the upper hand. What he said next wasn't a question, it was a line being drawn, a demand to present identification. Maya wasn't surprised. She stepped back, a small movement, but enough to create space in case things escalated. No one had ever taught her to fear a police officer, but experience had taught her to calculate when facing someone who wielded power like a cudgel. Her reply was direct. She refused, and that, for Greg, felt like a slap across the face of habit. She didn't raise her voice, but each word pierced the armor of authority he was used to wearing. When he stepped forward again, it wasn't out of protocol. It was confusion hardened into the challenge. Greg asked who she thought she was, and was immediately cut off. Maya didn't let him finish the attack. She stated she was a citizen exercising her legal right to move freely. No extra words, no added logic. And her voice, though not loud, was sharp and clear, like a deadbolt locking into place in the quiet. Greg didn't respond right away. His face began to flush, veins rising on his neck, and in his eyes flickered something raw, uncontrolled. He had dealt with stubborn people before, but this wasn't defiance out of arrogance. This was the composure of someone who understood she was being wronged and had no intention of letting it slide. A woman pushing a stroller passed by. She slowed for a second, glanced over, then quickly looked down and kept moving. Greg saw, and he knew what it meant. A witness. He was used to operating beyond observation, where every word belonged to him. But not this time. This time, he didn't own the space. And the weight of that truth pressed down on him inch by inch. When he said he would call for a check, it came out like a final lifeline. Maya didn't object, didn't plead. She simply said one thing: do what you need to do. But to Greg, those words weren't light. They rang in his ears like a silent challenge, something he wasn't used to receiving. He stepped back, moved toward the car, but slowly. Each step was heavy, as if he were walking into something he no longer knew how to control. Maya stood still, her eyes following, not out of fear, but to remember every movement, every expression, every moment. Because she knew a man like Greg wouldn't stop just because he'd been warned. Above, the sun had vanished behind a streak of gray clouds. The light faded, and the soft morning air now carried a faint, uneasy chill. Things were only just beginning, and Maya could feel it. The wind had shifted. Greg returned to the car, hand rummaging through his jacket pocket as if searching for a radio, but his eyes never left Maya. She stood still, head slightly tilted, spine straight, gaze unshaken. In that posture, she didn't look like someone avoiding trouble. She looked like someone counting the beats of another's loss of control. She recognized that look. It wasn't the look of someone carrying out duty. It was the look of someone searching for an excuse to justify an overreaction. Greg wasn't looking for a radio. He was buying time, either to suppress an emotion or justify what he was about to do. He didn't know who she was, but he knew she wasn't like most people he'd encountered. Calmly, Maya pulled her phone from the side pocket. The movement practiced. She raised it to chest level without a word. She didn't need to say anything. The phone pointed at Greg was a silent reminder. Every action from this point had a witness. No intervention needed. Just documentation. Greg saw it, and his response outpaced his thoughts. A twitch in the cheek, a loaded step. Then he lunged, no warning, no command. Just a blunt kick straight to Maya's wrist, quick and violent. The phone flew from her hand, spinning midair before smashing onto the concrete. The sound crack rang louder than any spoken threat. The screen shattered, tiny shards scattered, webbing the ground like fractures. A man jogging with headphones paused to remove one. An elderly woman walking her dog turned around. No one spoke, but everyone stopped. Maya stepped half a foot back, hand still at her side. She didn't strike back. She didn't need to. What just happened was enough to bring this to court, but what she felt was something more, not fear, a boundary, and Greg had just crossed it. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but didn't care. He kept approaching, pointing a finger at her, voice rising. "You just resisted an officer in the line of duty." The words were a script, rehearsed, repeated. Each time he needed authority without evidence. His other hand was sliding toward his handcuffs, thumb brushing the familiar release. His body tilted forward, a stance he'd used countless times to subdue someone. But this time, the person he was about to touch wasn't just any civilian, and Greg didn't know that. Maya knew he was about to make contact. No one had to say it. She didn't need to see the whole motion. Her body felt it, from the wind's angle to the ground's faint tremble. She wasn't someone who struck first, but her decision had already solidified, cold and final. If he touched her, she would not stay passive. And in that moment, the air felt like a glass wall, beginning to crack, thin but already splintering, as Rose said. As Greg reached in, the distance between them was just a step. He leaned in, a move too familiar, one he'd made on people who had no way to fight back. But this time, he chose the wrong person. Maya rotated her upper body to the right, knees slightly lowered. Her right hand slid down to the level of Greg's knee, hooking his left leg with a soft but precise pull no brute force. Just the right pressure at the right point. As Greg shifted his weight forward, she nudged in the opposite direction. The counter wasn't loud, it wasn't brutal, but it was absolute. Greg lost balance and his whole body pitched forward. His outstretched arm twisted by reflex. His knee struck the grass edge. His hand couldn't catch him. The rest of his body collapsed awkwardly and uncontrollably. Clumsy, humiliated. No one quite grasped what had just happened. It took less than a second. A police officer threatening a black woman, booming a moment ago, now lay face down in damp grass. No screaming, no violence, just a pivot. A maneuver so precise, so efficient, it was terrifying. Greg gasped for air as he tried to rise. His hands clutched the earth like someone pulled from a whirlpool. His face flushed, half from pain, half from shame and shock. He looked up at Maya, but before he could spit out a word, she moved. Maya didn't speak. She simply reached behind her back, pulling a small item from a hidden pocket at her waist. She stepped toward Greg, not in haste, not in menace, and held it up to his eye level, a gleaming badge. The Federal Bureau of Investigation logo shone at the center. The silver trim caught the sun like a blade. Greg froze. His eyes tightened. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't get up again. The park fell nearly silent. The man who had stood hesitantly earlier now stepped fully forward, eyes wide. A young woman from afar had started recording on her phone. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, voice timid. "Mom, is she a real agent?" Greg stood motionless. His hand still hovered near his belt, where just moments ago it was ready to draw cuffs. Now that hand is useless. No more weapons, no more authority, just disbelief and fear. Maya looked at him, not with anger, not with coldness, but with clarity so sharp it needed no explanation. She didn't back away, nor did she advance. She simply stood there, badge in hand, a silent declaration, "I know who I am. Do you?" Then her voice broke the silence. Steady, slow, without emphasis. "Do you know who you just kicked?" Greg stood frozen like a statue, still damp with cement. Rough, cracked, and exposed under the eyes of dozens. His hand hung mid-air, mouth open as if to say something, but no sound came out. He had lost control of his breath, had no idea what to do with his hands. For the first time in his life, wearing a uniform, Greg didn't know who he was, if people didn't fear him. In front of him, Maya Carter stood tall, an FBI badge in her hand, gleaming like a clean cut through the synthetic skin of his fake identity. No shouting, no orders, just one decisive movement, calm, precise, enough to shatter the world Greg had thought was untouchable. She didn't call his name, didn't scold, didn't threaten, but her eyes, unblinking, unwavering, had become invisible blades, stripping Greg bare in front of the crowd, leaving him not a second to shield himself. He wasn't arrested, but he was exposed, and sometimes being seen for what you truly are hurts more than being cuffed. People started to gather. No one pushed, no one shouted, but one by one they raised their phones, as if everyone wanted to record the moment a monument of power melted in broad daylight. The air thinned. Silence stopped being calm. It became heavy, the kind of silence Greg had never faced from the other side of a command. A woman in a gray hoodie stepped forward, right behind Maya. She didn't ask what had happened. She just raised her phone and filmed Greg's face, like she was documenting a landmark being erased from history. And Greg, terrifyingly, couldn't move, not because he was restrained, but because the truth had seized his mind with a power he'd never trained to withstand, public truth. Something cracked inside Greg's head, not out of fear of disciplinary action, but because for the first time he saw how the public no longer looked at him as a protector, but as an intruder in uniform. Maya lowered her badge, saying nothing more. Her movement was slow, deliberate, like a period at the end of a paragraph that needed no editing. She slipped the badge into her pocket, her eyes never leaving his. No mockery, no satisfaction, but in that gaze, Greg saw one thing clearly. You just kicked something the system can't protect you from. Truth. Maya turned her back. No words. No nod. No goodbye. She simply walked away, slow and steady, with the posture of someone who had just completed a mission, even if it had never been assigned. But each of those steps, to Greg, was the final knock on the door of self-delusion he had locked himself behind for 2 decades. No one stopped her. No one dared intervene. Everyone stepped aside, as if instinctively clearing the way for something beyond routine. This wasn't a woman just stood up. This was the system correcting itself. Greg remained standing, or rather, was left behind. What he once called control now felt like nothing more than worn-out reflexes, clenched fists, grinding teeth, eyes trying not to blink. But deep down he knew every layer of armor he had once relied on was crumbling, not from a physical blow, but from the complete stillness of the crowd. Not a single person stepped in to defend him. Not one. The woman with the hoodie lowered her phone. She said nothing. She turned to a man nearby and shook her head. Not in refusal, but like whispering to herself, "Can't trust anymore." A young boy tugged his mother's hand and pointed at Greg. "Mom, why isn't the policeman doing anything?" The mother didn't answer. She just gripped her son's hand tighter and quietly pulled him away. In the distance, Maya had disappeared behind the trees, but before vanishing completely, she paused, didn't turn back, just stopped, as if deliberately letting him know she could come back at any time, and, if needed, she would. Greg felt his chest tighten, not from physical harm, but from a new kind of fear, the helplessness of a man who had lived by the system, now realizing it no longer shielded him. He bent down to pick up the shattered pieces of his phone. A corner of the screen still blinked faintly like him, a device once meant to be evidence, now a symbol, not in power, but of undeniable proof. And when he looked up again, no one remained. Just him, a trampled lawn, and a question still unanswered. Who did I just hit, and now what? Greg drove back to the station in silence. The radio was off. Dashboard lights blinked, but he didn't care. Each rotation of the tires on the road seemed to jar his grip on reason. He muttered to himself, unclear whether it was thought or some stubborn mantra. "I've gotten out before. This time will be the same." He kept repeating it like a charm for reassurance, but the words sounded weaker each time, like echoes fading in an empty room. He knew this incident wasn't like the others. No way to finesse the report, no partner to tweak a statement. No file that could be rewritten. This time, he had confronted an FBI agent, and everyone had seen it. In the past, there had been a scuffle at a gas station, a complaint over an unjustified arrest, and a deleted internal audio file. All of it was covered up. He was praised as tough under pressure. He used to think the more times he survived accusations, the more untouchable he became. But today, it all collapsed in minutes. With just one kick, one badge, and one silent stare that froze an entire system in place. Greg walked into the station lobby, the door clicking behind him with a sound that echoed like a bell in his mind. Inside, operations carried on, but the way people reacted to his presence changed the atmosphere. A young officer quickly lowered his head, avoiding eye contact. A senior officer reading a file pretended to be more focused than necessary. The female officer at the reception, who used to crack jokes when Greg entered, didn't look up this time. Someone chuckled, but the smile didn't reach their eyes. Greg saw it. It wasn't a greeting. It was a quiet declaration. "We saw the video. We know what just happened. And this time, you're on your own." He slipped past the rows of desks, heading straight to the locker room. No one said a word, but Greg could feel the cold stab running down his spine. No eyes met his, yet their weight hit harder than any accusation. In the locker room, he dropped onto the familiar wooden bench. It used to be the spot where he sat every morning before patrol, talking baseball, last night's game, or how to deal with those mouthy kids. Today, he couldn't say a thing, his hands pressed to his forehead, his back curled inward, a posture of surrender, even though no one had forced it. In front of him was the same old mirror. He used to check it every day, to adjust his cap, straighten his badge, and tuck in his shirt. Now, it reflected someone unrecognizable, a man without direction, without confidence, stripped of the armor he once wore, like an impenetrable suit. No one knocked, no one asked you okay, and it was that silence, the complete absence of support, of voices, of any lifeline, that made it hit home. Greg Harding was no longer the man he had been yesterday. He looked at himself. The uniform was wrinkled, the collar askew, the name tag slightly chipped. Everything looked like it had been through a fight, but no one had touched him but himself. The eyes in the reflection no longer had the edge of a patrol leader, only the emptiness of someone who no longer controlled anything, not even his face. Greg wasn't afraid of getting fired. He had seen others make worse mistakes, get suspended, then return to duty after a few weeks of internal review. Some had lost their weapons, beaten the wrong person, broken pursuit protocol, yet they all came back after a few reports citing lack of evidence or actions within acceptable range. What shook Greg wasn't the risk of losing his job. It was the look Maya left behind in his mind. That stare didn't accuse, didn't overpower, didn't raise its voice, but it was a force that silenced everything around. He had never felt as exposed as when he stood before her, not because she was stronger, but because the system around him no longer shielded him from someone like her. This time, no one would revise the paperwork for him. No colleague would submit a favorable report. No internal affairs team would construct a version of events to preserve the honor of a veteran officer. Because the victim this time wasn't a single mother, a poor teenager, or a confused old man. It was a federal agent. And worse, she held all the evidence. Greg let out a dry laugh, a twisted, hollow sound. No feeling behind it. Just an involuntary spasm from a psyche trying to defend itself. He wasn't sinking into guilt, but into the realization that he had crossed a line, and there was nothing solid left on the other side to hold on to. Suddenly, his phone vibrated, a message from a familiar number at dispatch. The video's out, spreading fast. He didn't open it, didn't need to. Greg knew. Just one angle, one frame, of Maya flashing her badge, one shot of him crumpled on the ground, eyes wide. That was enough to make sure this town would never look at him the same way again. His hand trembled, not from public backlash, but because he knew, in this storm, the only person who could stop it was the one who had walked away, without saying she would forgive. Greg exhaled sharply, but no breath came out. His chest strained like it would explode. He didn't know what to cling to. There was no protocol for cop kicks FBI, no department manual for you're the one in the wrong and she's more powerful than you. He bowed his head, not out of guilt, not from regret, but because, for the first time in his life, Greg Harding understood what it meant to have no one left to run interference for him. Maya couldn't sleep that night. Not because of lingering anger. She wasn't angry. Since joining the Bureau, Maya had learned to separate emotion from response. She knew emotions could skew standards, blur the line between resistance and retaliation, but there were still moments that wouldn't let the mind rest. And what haunted her wasn't Greg's violent behavior, but the look in his eyes, the look of someone who believed he'd get away with it again, like he had so many times before. That confidence didn't come from innocence, it came from a system that had shielded him. That was what Maya couldn't shake. The next morning, she arrived at the office earlier than usual. No one else was there. The crisp quiet of a new week only made the weight on her back feel heavier. The temporary access to the internal Federal Review server, granted for a previous evaluation project, was still active, a minor privilege, now a critical tool. She sat down, opened the secure terminal, and typed her first query. Harding, Greg, complaint history. The system loaded slowly, not from error, but from volume. A list emerged like a buried timeline cloaked in administrative euphemisms. Filed, rejected, non-actionable, transferred, pending, never reopened. Most complaints were dated between 2013-2018 in the Bronx, New York. One name made Maya's heart skip. Jamal Edwards, 17 years old, head injury, no scene footage. She remembered. That year, she was an intern, assigned to support civil rights file analysis under the Office of Behavioral Oversight, OBB. The Jamal case had sparked quiet debate. He was a minor with no criminal history, yet labeled as resisting during detainment. The case was later referred back to local authorities. Maya had once asked in a meeting, "Why isn't the officer's name in the investigation summary?" The supervisor replied, "We're not to probe further. That came from upstairs." Back then, she was just a shadow in a room full of senior attorneys and specialists. She had marked Jamal's file with a red question mark, but never had the authority to reopen it. Now, Greg Harding's name stared back at her, no longer a floating piece, but the exact match in a puzzle someone had deliberately left incomplete. Maya's back tensed. She didn't feel satisfied. No thrill of catching the bad guy. What she felt was duty. If she hadn't remembered that name, if she hadn't opened the system that morning, Greg would have once again passed over a victim without leaving a trace strong enough to hold him accountable. But the system, if asked the right questions, doesn't forget. And Maya had never forgotten. She reopened Jamal's file. Read it slowly, line by line, as if afraid to miss a detail. The complaint was unnervingly short. Felt Officer Harding used excessive force for unclear reasons. Witness present but unreachable. No specific time, no injury description. Just a thin statement about an incident that left a teenager needing 7 stitches above the brow. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten line in black ink. Family not pursuing legal action. The margin bore a code used internally for cases marked closed due to insufficient investigative momentum. She switched to the witness tab. The first name was Devontae Mills, 18 at the time, lived 2 doors down from Jamal. Maya entered his name into a separate system that tracked behavioral data and witness interview. The result, previously noted as an unofficial witness in the detainment of Jamal Edwards. Unreachable after 2 attempts. A field coordinator report appeared. Upon arrival, Mills did not open the door. Calls unanswered. Conclusion, witness unwilling to participate. That conclusion line was crossed out in red pen. Maya leaned back, eyes still fixed on the screen. Something felt wrong. Not just the sparse presentation of the file, but the sense that someone had carefully edited each paragraph to make everything look just legitimate enough. She took notes on everything. Filing times, internal routing codes, names of staff who handled the file. Greg's name was never listed under officer in question, only in end-stage footnotes, as if a shadow floating on the margins of the story. She'd seen that kind of trace before, when someone was being soft-handled to protect an insider. This time, Maya wasn't taking notes for data review. She was writing them down to make sure she wouldn't forget. Suddenly, her desk phone buzzed. A message popped up from a special assistant in the analysis unit. "You just pulled 6 files connected to Harding. Something wrong?" Maya stared at the words. Her fingers didn't type right away. She let it sit for a few seconds, then replied, "Not sure, but something's never been right." She stood, walked to the office window. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Cars rolled past. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Life kept ticking forward. But Maya knew, inside this system, in the data web she had just touched, some people once cried out and were buried because the one who hurt them had someone to tidy it up. This time, she wasn't looking away. Because some names may fade on paper, but never in the memory of those who witnessed. The files kept surfacing. Maya wasn't approaching this as a rebellion. She was simply connecting the dots someone else had once tried to blur. No emotional annotations, no marks of anger, just typing, reviewing, filtering, and organizing. But the deeper she dug, the more she sensed something that didn't appear on screen. A silent pressure, spreading not through words, but through the way people around her started growing quieter. One Thursday afternoon, just as she was about to leave the office, Maya received a message from the admin. "You are requested on the 4th floor, Assistant Director Banks's office." She knew the 4th floor. No one got called up there unless it was serious or classified. Richard Banks was a familiar name. A superior Maya once respected, calm, sharp, good at coordination, and especially skilled at saying sensitive things in ways no one could push back on. The door closed. No recording. No transcript. "Ms. Carter," he began in a low voice, eyes not meeting hers, but settling gently on the wooden table between them. "I know you had your reasons. I believe you weren't acting out of personal vendetta." Maya sat straight. No nod, no denial. "But I need you to understand," he continued, voice steady as ever. "Some cases are not just about facts. They are about structure, and Harding was once part of a coordinated network at the state level. Some of the files involving him bear signatures not just from the FBI. Maya paused briefly. She heard every word. Nothing was surprising. But the way he said it, calm, without threat or leniency, made it colder than any direct warning. "The former federal police office collaborated with various local agencies," he went on, "and there were understandings never publicly disclosed. I'm not saying Harding was innocent, but I need you to realize if you dig too far, what you'll uncover won't be about one man. It'll be about a network, and that network is still tied to us in ways not easily undone." Then he looked up. His eyes finally met hers. "If you proceed, there will be consequences. Not for you, for the unit." It was a message with no memo, no classification number, no warning stamped on paper. But Maya knew it was a warning. She nodded, emotionless. "I understand." Banks held her gaze for a moment, then pushed his chair back, as if everything had been said. Maya left the office in silence. The elevator doors closed behind her, ceiling lights reflecting off cold stainless steel. Her hands hung loose, but her mind was calculating the next steps. Because now she knew she wasn't just confronting Greg. She was confronting the layer of power that had produced him. Maya left Banks' office without anger, without surprise. In truth, she had been preparing for that moment since she first saw Greg's name buried in the old records. What Banks had just said, clever, political, and borderline courteous, only confirmed one thing. Her investigation was no longer about a single individual. She returned to her desk and sat before the screen. No new tabs, no new names. She simply reopened Greg's entire file archive, not to uncover new facts, but to see who had signed off, who had closed the files, who had been the final reviewer when reports were shelved. A pattern emerged, not from the data, but from the human structure. The same cluster of names appears across various ranks. Some had retired, some had recently been promoted, but they shared one trait. They had all held positions high enough that no one had the time to double-check their decisions. They were the system's insiders, the names that showed up the least but always stood behind the final signature. The real question was no longer who Greg was, but who had allowed Greg to exist, term after term, restructure after restructure. without ever being questioned. Maya printed the full archive, no external drives, no email. Each document was numbered, grouped, and labeled in separate folders. These weren't precautions taken out of fear of being watched, but because now, caution was no longer a sign of fear. It was the strategy. By nightfall, the office was nearly empty. She turned on her desk lamp, shut the laptop, and got ready to leave. Then the desk phone buzzed. Unknown number. No name. No traceable metadata. She picked up. "Good evening, Ms. Carter." A man's voice. Low, clear, polite. No hostility, no orders. But also no small talk. "I'm just calling to say there are some files that shouldn't be reopened. Not because they're wrong, but because they're wrong. But because there's no one left in the right position to fix them." Maya said nothing. She didn't hang up. She didn't ask for a name. She simply let the silence expand. The kind of silence that told the other side she heard and she was still there. A slow breath, then the line went dead. Maya set the receiver down, not gently, not harshly, just as she always did. But inside, something had shifted. Because if the system, with all its walls and seasoned personnel, had to send someone to call her directly, it meant they were no longer certain. And if they were beginning to fear her, it meant she was finally on the right track, and she wouldn't stop. The video went viral less than 48 hours after the incident. A 1-minute, 39-second clip, stitched together from 3 different angles and uploaded by an anonymous account, was posted with the caption, "Officer kicks woman, then freezes when she pulls this out." The footage paused at the exact moment Greg hit the ground, then cut to Maya pulling out her badge. No commentary. No voiceover, just a pulsing, dramatic soundtrack and flashing red text. "She's FBI." Within 12 hours, it had reached major platforms and appeared in local news segments. Hashtags exploded overnight. "Justice for Carter." "FBI Viv's police power." "Not just another victim." Maya never liked the spotlight, and she certainly didn't want her name tied to trending hashtags. But now she had no choice. She hadn't asked to become a symbol. Social media doesn't ask for consent. That morning at the office, someone patted her shoulder and asked if she was okay. A colleague left a handwritten note saying, "My whole family's behind you." Someone else placed coffee on her desk without a name. But at the same time, her email inbox began to fill with messages like, "People like you deserve to be dealt with. You think the FBI will protect you forever? Traitor to the badge." Maya was no stranger to polarized responses. She had worked on controversial cases before. What struck her now was the speed. Every minute, every hour, more accounts joined the online conversation about her. Not all of them used real names. Many belonged to far-right groups previously investigated in cases involving racial hatred and police violence. One verified account on a major platform posted, "She's not a real agent. This is a deep state setup." Below it were hundreds of reposts and thousands of comments, mockery, insults, even calls to track down her identity. An extremist YouTube channel recreated the entire incident in CGI, altering Maya's face to something more hostile, more suspicious. The video gained over 2 million views in 2 days. A photoshopped image of Maya in a suit was changed to show her in a fascist uniform, with the caption, "This is how they control the system from within." She became a symbol, but not the kind she ever wanted. Not of justice. Her name was now ammunition in a conflict between those who believed in law and those who believed law had been hijacked. And Maya understood that the scariest part wasn't being misunderstood. It was being used by people who had no interest in the truth. On social media, Maya became a symbol, stretched in every direction. Some called her a brave victim. Others saw her as a clear-headed agent pushing back against a corrupt system. But there were also accounts labeling her a federal threat, a puppet of the deep state, or worse, a pawn in a plan to divide law enforcement. The names attached to her grew more numerous by the day, but none of them were hers. And even when the screens turned off after every interview, every headline, every post, Maya still had to go to work, buy groceries, pump gas like anyone else. And out there, the stares she got were no longer from avatars, but from real people in real space. Looks that were part recognition, part suspicion, and part surveillance. One afternoon, while stopping at a gas station, a man approached her. He wasn't old. He wasn't in a rush. His voice was calm at first. He asked if she was the woman from the video. Maya nodded, not dodging the question. His face stayed unreadable, but his eyes lingered too long. Then he said, evenly, "Careful. Not everyone likes that kind of fame." He turned and walked away, as if he had given her neutral advice. But the sentence stayed with Maya the rest of the day, like a soundless echo lodged in her brain. She began to notice strange cars parked near her home too often, and unfamiliar figures lingering outside her office hallway longer than they should. No one threatened her directly, no one violated her space, but Maya knew something was watching, not through noise but through presence. She told no one, filed no reports. There was still not enough cause to call it dangerous, but her instincts, sharpened from years of tracking criminals, would not let her dismiss it. And then, a few days later, it arrived. A flyer posted right at her door. No greeting, no return address. Bold text, slightly off-center, as if to disrupt the eye. The FBI doesn't represent justice, it represents betrayal of the people's police. No organizational logo, no contact information. But in the lower right corner, Maya noticed one detail most would miss: a faint fingerprint, left in the kind of ink used in former special ops training. Whoever left that flyer was no amateur. Maya kept the flyer. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't tell anyone, but she committed every detail to memory, not out of fear, but because she needed to know who was watching her and how. What concerned her had never been loud threats. She'd faced plenty. What unsettled her was the sudden quiet, when no one mentioned her anymore, when no new posts appeared, and the once viral hashtags vanished from timeline. For Maya, silence was never closure. It was a sign of movement beneath the surface, and when that silence came from the system itself, it meant someone was trying to kill the noise, not by exposure, but by control. That's why Maya was never afraid of being watched. What scared her was the possibility of being erased, like the victims in the old case files she had read. Names no one remembered, warnings ignored because they weren't big enough to matter. If her actions forced the powerful to reopen old records, to answer questions long buried, then she would take the chaos, because the cost of silence has never been peace. It is only the delay before a greater collapse. Maya sat in front of the screen, watching the list of complaints stretch longer and longer. She wasn't relying on personal intuition anymore. This was the stage of tracing. Every case marked suspended or sufficient evidence, or closed at victim's request, was flagged by a long-honed investigative instinct. Where power is abused, there is always a blind spot built to protect it. One case from 2016 surfaced. Lydia Monroe, a school administrator in the suburbs of Syracuse. Her son, Deshaun Monroe, then just 1, was arrested during recess for threatening behavior via eye contact. The report, written by Greg Harding himself, noted, "Held at the police station for 4 hours without a guardian present. No documented evidence of threatening behavior. No school camera footage. No independent supervision record." The complaint was filed a week later, then withdrawn. Reason unknown. Mail checked the digital archive. The PDF file had been opened twice, but no additional information had been entered since the day it was submitted. It was the kind of file that didn't disappear, just never went anywhere. She didn't make a call, didn't send an email. Maya put on her coat, got in the car, and drove straight to the address listed in the file. A quiet, aging neighborhood, trimmed lawns, white fences, and flower pots on the porch. The house looked like it belonged to someone who knew how to keep things in order, even when the inside hadn't known peace for years. When Maya rang the bell, the woman who opened the door didn't ask who she was. Lydia Monroe, tired around the eyes but still sharp, looked at Maya for a few seconds before saying, "If you're here to ask about Deshaun, I'm not repeating what I already took back." Her voice was low, steady, and dry, like someone used to speaking without ever being fully heard. Maya nodded without arguing. "I'm not here to push you, but if there's anything related to that file, I need it." Lydia looked at her gaze not cold but cautious. She glanced down at the steps, then let out a faint breath. "I'm a public employee. If I speak up, I lose my job. But if you want the file," she didn't finish the sentence. She simply turned and walked back inside, leaving the door cracked open like an ellipsis. Maya didn't follow. She stood still, respecting the space of someone caught between fear and integrity. About 8 minutes later, Lydia returned. In her hands was a clear plastic box, sealed with aged duct tape. Inside was a stack of paper records, the original signed complaint, a photocopy of a bruise behind the neck, and timestamps matching the school absence. Nothing else, no explanation. She didn't hand it over directly. She placed it on the door frame and said, "Meant to send this years ago, but then I thought, send it to who?" Maya took the box with both hands, as if it held something fragile. No more words were exchanged, but in Lydia's eyes, Maya saw it clearly. Not all victims wait for justice. Some just wait for someone brave enough to unearth the memories the system had buried like they never existed. 10 minutes later, Lydia returned. This time, the plastic box showed more wear. The tape yellowed, the edges discolored. No labels, no notes. Maya noticed how tightly Lydia gripped it, as if she had debated hundreds of times whether to keep it or throw it out. Inside, faded pages were visible. The original signed complaint, a stamped acknowledgement from the local precinct, and a set of color-printed photos. Bruises on the back of Deshawn's neck, with handwritten captions under each one. Time of arrest, 10:14. IEMAM. Time of release, 2:07 p.m. Time mother arrived, denied contact, 11:02. "I kept this in case I needed a lawyer," Lydia said, her voice flat like she was reading a headline aired years ago, "but I never used it." Maya took the box again, silently, but her gaze lingered longer than usual, not to ask more, but so Lydia would know. Everything had been recorded, and none of it would go to waste. The silence in that moment wasn't heavy, but full of meaning, like a thank you that didn't need to be spoken. As Lydia placed a hand on the door, ready to close it, she looked Maya in the eye. This time, the look sharper, almost a challenge. "I don't know whether to be glad someone finally came after him, or scared that person is you." The door closed behind her. No slam, just finality. Maya turned and walked slowly back to the car. She placed the box carefully in the passenger seat, like evidence that had finally emerged from the dark. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. What mattered now was staying clear-headed. Those sheets weren't just proof. They were the prologue that people had tried to distort and then tuck away into nameless drawers. On the way back, Maya didn't turn on the radio. Everything around her passed like a silent film. Faded signs, a roadside gas station, a sleepy bakery. But in her mind, Lydia's image remained vivid, eyes dry, no longer trembling, but also nopeful. It was the look of someone who once believed in procedure and was pushed into the role of someone without standing to respond. She knew what lay ahead wouldn't just be sterile reports or forgotten complaint forms. She'd face voices that had been lost, cries for help smothered by bureaucratic formulas. And the most haunting part, some of those victims, real victims, had grown so used to silence they no longer knew whether to hope. She understood why they were afraid. No one wants to be the next name the system deletes. But she also knew if she gave up, no one else would keep going. Greg sat in the lawyer's office, hands clenched on his knees, eyes locked on the floor. He no longer looked at the man across from him. No more chatter, no performance of being the misunderstood officer, just silence. What echoed in his mind wasn't Maya's words, but the moment she held up her badge, not loud, not dramatic, but final, like a blade slicing through the armor he had worn for years. Every person there, those recording, those watching, went quiet when the badge appeared, and so did he. The man across from him, a high-profile attorney and friend of an old contact from the coordination board, didn't bother with moralizing. He cut straight to the point, like pitching a strategy. "You were filmed without consent. Your reputation is damaged. You've been defamed professional. You can file a countersuit." Greg's brow furrowed. For a second, he almost nodded. a reflex from years of using that very tactic. He had once intimidated a teacher who filed a complaint about how he searched a student in class. He had forced a veteran to withdraw a complaint for disrespecting an officer. The system had long accommodated such counters, but this time he looked at his hands. They trembled. Sweat soaked the back of his neck. "Do I have a chance to win?" he asked, voice gravelly and low. The lawyer paused, then answered, "You didn't used to ask that." That answer stopped Greg cold. He knew it was true. He used to be the one giving answers, not seeking them. But now, after that kick, after the clip went viral, after that badge appeared on a public sidewalk, everything had shifted. This wasn't an internal problem. It wasn't a misstep to be quietly smoothed over. It had become a symbol, or both sides, those who had once been silenced and those who had worked to silence them. Who had he kicked? Not just a black woman, not just Maya Carter. He had kicked a federal agent trained to de-escalate dangerous situations, whose response had turned his act into a national indictment. Greg straightened slightly, but his shoulders sagged. His whole body seemed to fold in, shrinking under the pressure. The lawyer continued, "If you want to salvage your name, we can pursue a civil suit. Technically, you followed protocol. She overreacted." Greg heard him, but didn't respond. In his mind, Maya stood still. She had said nothing, offered no threat, just stared at him. And that stare had kept him silent ever since. For the first time in 20 years, Greg didn't know where he stood. He didn't know who might still rewrite a report for him, who might still soften an investigation. All he knew was this: the kick he delivered that day, just another reflex, was now asking for a payment far greater than he ever imagined. That night, Greg lay in bed, wide awake. His phone sat face down on the nightstand. The TV played on mute. A ticker rolled across the screen. Incident involving FBI agent and officer Greg Harding remains under review. He'd heard that phrase, under review, so many times it now made him nauseous. It had once shielded him. Now it was a reminder that he no longer controlled the narrative. He scrolled through contacts, old allies. Some had once posed with him at city ceremonies. Some had praised him as textbook fast response, but now no one answered. Messages showed read, no replies, no promises that he'd be fine. Greg was starting to understand. In this system, when you become a liability, you stop being a colleague. He searched for Maya online. No interviews. No media, no live streams. That scared him more than anything, because someone like Maya, if she stays quiet, is preparing something larger than words. No one goes that silent without a plan, and Greg had never learned to fight things that don't signal their next move. The next morning, his lawyer sent a media plan. "We suggest a talk show appearance to restore your image, along with a civil suit. The strategy is offense, control the narrative." Greg read it 3 times and didn't reply. Not because he didn't understand, but because, for the first time, he had no idea what the public saw when they looked at him. Sympathy, or the cold clarity of Maya's gaze. One former colleague, Jared, sent a private message. "I can't say anything publicly. But Greg, this time, it won't be easy." It was the only message Greg received in 3 days. He had once believed power came from weapons, badges, and knowing the right people. But now he was learning something harder. Real power comes from what isn't said, and when the ones who've suffered the most go silent, it's not because they're afraid. It's because they already know how the story ends. He stood and looked at himself in the mirror. His shirt was half-buttoned. The dark circles under his eyes could no longer be hidden. Greg Harding, seasoned officer, once comfortable in front of any camera, now found himself caught between silence and retaliation, in a battle where he no longer knew who was watching, who was listening, and whether anyone at all was still on his side. At 8:02 a.m. on Monday, an internal email was sent to all regional FBI staff and related federal units. Notice of internal investigation regarding the incident on the 24th. Subject: Greg Harding. No sensational headline, no emotional language, just a dry, by-the-book directive. But anyone who had worked in the system knew what it meant. When the FBI opens an internal investigation on its own, it means no one can bury the files anymore. and there's no more gray area to hide in. Less than 2 hours later, an article from independent investigative outlet Capitol Pulse went live. FBI agent kicked in public. Kicker was officer, with 4 buried complaints. The headline hit the trending list within 15 minutes. Below it were chillingly clinical summaries of each complaint. Dates, victims, reasons the cases were dropped, all laid out in a tone that sent shivers. No one knew where the leak came from, but everyone understood the system was starting to leak from within, and the fallout spread faster than any previous media crisis in the agency. Reporters stationed themselves outside HQ. The press office phone rang non-stop. Emails with the subject line, "Request to reopen Greg Harding's file," flooded in by the hundreds within a single afternoon. The head of administration called an emergency meeting. The spokesperson tried to stay calm, repeating, "This is standard protocol in any case involving federal elements." But the truth was, no previous case had triggered such a visible internal tremor. The organization wasn't under attack from the outside. The crack was right in the center. Greg was suspended by the end of the day. The decision was signed by the chief of police, the same man who had once shaken Greg's hand during an award ceremony 5 years prior. The reason stated plainly: to preserve the integrity of the system during investigation. No further explanation. No one tried to persuade Greg. No one offered comfort. He didn't react, didn't ask questions, didn't preemptively resign. He simply stood, walked to HR, signed the forms, handed in his firearm, ID, badge, basic uniform, and system access credentials. Each step followed the protocol, but his eyes were fixed on the floor, as if searching for a time when the system's silence still meant protection. What unsettled Greg wasn't the suspension. It was the atmosphere. It was the way people looked at him in the hallway, the reluctant nod from subordinates, the absence of even the smallest words of support. No one said, "I'm sure it'll be fine." No one pretended to ask, "Do you need anything?" Everyone seemed to be stepping back, or more simply, waiting to see how the system would handle him. Greg used to be Harding, the fastest closer in the West Zone. The rookie guys were told to model your instincts after, but now he was just Greg Harding, the suspended employee pending ethical review, and no one dared use the old title anymore. Within 48 hours of the investigation notice, the department, once operating like a solid machine, split into 3 distinct camps. One group stood by Greg, calling this a political takedown of a capable officer, and arguing, if someone gets suspended for reacting in the field, who's going to dare step up on the street? These were mostly officers who had worked night shifts with Greg, had lunch with him, and, more importantly, had benefited from his quick handling. The second group remained silent. No opinions, no likes, no shares. In meetings, they spoke only of operational details. These were people who understood too well. Any word spoken now could end up in their personnel file later. Their silence wasn't apathy, it was survival. They had seen too many people cut out for speaking at the wrong moment. The final group, small but increasingly vocal, were younger officers trained under a new model, more transparency, more data-driven, and with a clearer understanding that power no longer came automatically with the badge. They didn't campaign openly, but they didn't shy away when asked either. One officer, when interviewed for the internal newsletter, said plainly, "If we can't scrutinize ourselves, how can we expect the public to believe in the badge we wear?" The HR head was sent to each squad. No official minutes were recorded. The meetings focused on limiting public statements, awaiting the results, and avoiding media disruption. But one thing no memo could control was the hallway. The hallway had become the real court. No one spoke loudly, but the whispers when Greg walked by cut like blades. Thought he was untouchable. Who would have guessed? I was on shift that day too. Kinda heard some stuff. Greg wasn't new to rumors. But this was different. These weren't barroom stories. This was real-time erosion of credibility. And what shook him most was the silence of those who once shook his hand, smiled, and slapped his back, now avoiding his eyes when he entered the room. A young officer, not someone who hated him, casually muttered in the break room, "Didn't know he had a mark." That comment was recorded. The audio spread internally like fire on fuel. No one refuted it. No one took it down. Greg listened to the clip alone in his car in the parking lot. His hands gripped the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't angry. He didn't feel insulted, just stunned, as if the very profession he thought would shield him was now carefully stepping away, not with an order, but with glances. The court was no longer in a courtroom. It was where he used to drink his morning coffee. It was the look from the receptionist who once said, "Hang on, Harding. Let me finish making your cup." It was in the slow nod from the guard, who now didn't meet his eyes when handing back his visitor badge. And Greg knew, if he fell this time, no one would reach out to pull him up. Not out of hatred, but because everyone was now watching him as a test, to see whether this system still had enough honor left to clean itself. On the day the official lawsuit was filed, Maya walked into the regional federal courthouse under a gray morning sky. No sun, no rain, no entourage, no camera crews trailing behind. Just her, an Indian-American lawyer with deep eyes and a slight frame, and a leather case carrying everything they needed. Neither of them gave statements. No brightly colored suits, no nods to the lenses. Every step was quiet, just like how the entire incident had begun. But less than an hour later, the news had already spread across dozens of digital outlets. The first headline appeared on a local site, then got picked up by NBC. FBI agent sues police department for excessive force and federal abuse of power. The article was paired with a still from the viral video. Maya flashing her badge, Greg's stunned expression caught mid-frame, equal parts panic and disbelief. The press erupted. Legal columns ran detailed analyses. Familiar faces who had once spoken about police reform returned to the airwaves. Even neutral stations, which usually avoided racially sensitive cases, reopened files on Greg Harding. Names long pushed aside began resurfacing. Jamal Edwards, Lydia Monroe, Kayla Vasquez. Each one a chapter that had been left incomplete, now reconnected through the lawsuit Maya had lost. Civil rights groups issued statements in unison. From New York to New Mexico, organizations that once ignored petitions now voiced their support publicly. Names previously labeled too radical were quoted in editorials. A 5,000-word piece appeared in The Atlantic. The problem isn't one officer. It's the place that made him think he was untouchable. The narrative stopped being about a single incident and began interrogating the system itself. Why hadn't Greg Harding been stopped sooner? Who signed off on his file as resolved? How many complaints were redirected to avoid internal friction? And how many people, Maya among them, had lived under the shadow of forced silence? Maya made no public statement, but she went to work every day, she checked her mail, she processed documents, everything by the book, and it was that quiet consistency that disrupted the system most. This was no longer a powerless victim seeking justice. It was someone from inside the system who had endured enough, now using the very rules she was trained in to challenge the machine that built her. For Maya, this was no longer a personal battle. She had once believed silence was part of professionalism, but that moment, the kick, the fall, the look in his eyes, made something undeniably clear. When a system demands silence in the face of wrongdoing, that silence is no longer professionalism, it is complicity. And if the system fell silent again, it wouldn't just fail justice, it would face something even more painful than failure, the reckoning that it stood by, eyes open, while what was right went unspoken. A week after the lawsuit became public, Maya received her first letter. No return name, no postmark from an official branch, just a light gray envelope, unsealed but deliberately clean. Inside, a folded piece of paper. No letterhead, no title, just a single line in neat black ink. He once trained me. Now I realize I should be thankful I didn't become him. Thank you for standing up when we all turned away. Maya set the letter on her desk and stared at it for minutes without touching her phone. She didn't know who wrote it, a former colleague, a rookie from years ago, or someone who once stood quietly in the hallway watching a different version of Greg Harding. What she did know was this: the writer had once stayed silent, and now they had chosen to speak. The next day, another letter arrived. Same envelope, same paper. This time, the handwriting slanted and wavered slightly, but every word was steady in its resolve. I was the one who reviewed the 2018 complaint records. They forced me to close it for lack of grounds. I still have the printouts. If needed, I'm willing to share them. No name signed. Dots kept their currencies dosed in the lower right corner, slightly misaligned, as if to say, I'm still here, just close enough to watch. Not yet ready to appear. The letters didn't arrive on a schedule. Some days brought 2, some weeks none, but each one shared a thread. They came from people who had once been silent, once afraid, once convinced that their voices would change nothing. Now they were sending memories, through handwriting, through ink, through the tangible weight of guilt and reflection. None signed their full names, but each sentence carried more power than applause or public praise, because it came from conscience, from the ache of remembering, from the moment when they could have spoken but didn't. Maya didn't know if they were still in the system or had left it behind, but she knew this much. They had once believed they were just parts of a wall too solid to crack. Now they believed that maybe, just maybe, the wall had started to shift. The structure, once seemingly unshakable with policies, cameras, badges, and commendations, had begun to fracture, not with noise, not with spectacles, but through quiet comments in elevators, anonymous photocopies left on an investigator's desk, an old report accidentally dropped into the special prosecutor's mailbox. Maya didn't need to know who they were. She just needed to make sure the wave they had started wouldn't be stifled by waiting. Some mornings, she read letters before making coffee, not for motivation, but as a reminder that she was no longer standing alone. Not everyone would stand with her, but each memory shared, each piece of evidence delivered into the right hands, was a sign that someone had chosen courage over fear. Because a story doesn't shake a system with a scream. It shakes it when the people once silenced begin to believe they don't have to whisper anymore. On Friday night, Community Hall No. 14 in South Atlanta opened its doors for an unofficial gathering. No poster, no bold theme, just a handwritten note taped to the glass. We need to talk. Maya arrived earlier than planned. No security detail. No one holding a mic or clearing the way. She opened the door herself, found her own seat near the front, and, when the time came, stepped onto a small plywood platform, less than half a meter high, usually used for weekend civic classes. She didn't wear a suit, no name tag, no badge, no printed documents, just a plain earth-toned sweater, dark slacks, and a pair of worn canvas shoes. In her pocket, folded in half, was a single sheet of paper. In the audience were about 60 people, single mothers with kids, elderly men and women in the back row. Some arrived by bus, some parked bikes outside. A few law students brought handheld recorders and thick notebooks. Some clearly didn't know who Maya was, but they all shared one thing: they didn't look away. Maya didn't begin with greetings or a bio. She stood still for a few seconds, letting the ceiling lights reveal her face clearly, then began to speak, without a microphone. I'm not here as an agent. I'm here because I used to stay silent. The room seemed to fall inward at her words. A long stillness followed. Maya began recounting, in a low, steady voice, that morning jog, Greg pulling up, the repeated empty questions with no investigative intent into her phone, the way he looked at her, not as a person. And the moment she pushed back, then showed her badge, not to defend herself, but to force the system to see her for who she was. There was no rhetoric in her story, no sharp tone, no stage presence, but each sentence landed clean, like a blade through thin fabric. The audience didn't nod, didn't gasp, but their faces shifted from tense to focused to finally silent. Maya paused, not to catch her breath, but to ask the question she had kept to herself since it all happened, one she saved for this very night. If I hadn't shown my badge that day, what would have... She looked up, scanning the room. If I hadn't stood up, who would be next? No one answered. They didn't have to. The silence in the room no longer came from fear, but from the clarity that they had just heard truth, unfiltered, ununiformed, unamplified. And that gathering, without slogans, live streams, or charts, became one of the moments that showed Maya something real, that sometimes what changes a community doesn't come from courts, the press, or elite task forces. It comes from a Friday night when someone who once stayed quiet steps forward and tells their story without a single title attached. Maya stopped exactly when she needed to, not from strain, not for effect, but to look out at nearly 60 pairs of eyes locked on her. No one spoke, no one shuffled. She didn't stare anyone down. She didn't use eye contact as a weapon, just a slow, steady scan, giving space for the next question to land where it needed to. If I hadn't shown my badge that day, she began again, voice softer now, what would have happened? A long pause followed. No chairs creaked, no one coughed, no phones rang. She didn't wait for an answer, and she knew they didn't need to give one. Who would this happen to next if I stayed silent? She continued, almost whispering, but clear enough for even the last row to hear. That question wasn't meant to shock. It wasn't a closing line for applause. It was a quiet sentence laid like a verdict on all the denials, delays, and distortions the system had ever made. Because without the flash of a silver badge that day, the next thing might have been blood, handcuffs, and another person added to a forgotten statistic. At the back of the room, a woman placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder, saying nothing, eyes glassy. A law student stopped her pen, realizing no line could capture that moment. An old man in a baseball cap lowered his head, then nodded slightly. Maya didn't seize the moment to rally. She didn't wave or thank the crowd, didn't call for action. She simply folded the note in her hand, quietly without sound, and said, in a voice just loud enough to carry, "We don't need a uniform to know what's wrong, and we don't need rank to fix it." She stepped down as slowly as she stepped up. No thunderous applause, but none was needed. No one in the hall wanted to break that silence with noise, because what had just happened wasn't a speech. It was truth, shown in its barest form. A person standing up not to demand justice for herself, but to remind the room that if we don't defend the vulnerable when they are wronged, then one day the silenced one could be us. As Maya walked out, someone stood, not to follow, but to leave their seat with a different stride than when they entered. Someone asked to take a photo. She shook her head. She said, "Tell it to the person next to you instead." And they did, because that night, truth didn't wear a uniform, but it was present through the one who dared to speak and through those who finally began listening with their hearts, not their hierarchy. The day of the official hearing began with a light rain. Not heavy, not loud, but just enough to dampen coats and make collars feel cold and heavy at the nape. No one spoke loudly. No one came to cause a scene. Federal courtroom, 4th floor, once reserved for routine state-level civil suits, had now become the quiet epicenter of something heavier than any one individual's story. Greg sat at the left table. His face remained composed, but it was the kind of composure that had been forged through too many sleepless nights. Light gray suit, deep red tie, clean-shaven jaw. He didn't glance sideways, but his hands, resting on his knees, kept moving, subtly, unconsciously. His lawyer, an experienced Italian-American known for civil rights defense, nodded with professional calm each time the judge explained the structure of the proceedings. But it was clear they both knew the public was not on their side. Across the room sat Maya. No uniform, no badge, just a simple black suit, hair pulled into a tight bun, no makeup. She didn't look at Greg, didn't lower her head. Her eyes stayed on the testimony table, her breath steady. It wasn't coldness, it was readiness, not to win, but to face whatever came. The courtroom was more crowded than expected. Extra chairs had been brought in, people lined the walls. A young mother with a baby carrier stood in the aisle. A group of law students from Morehouse scribbled notes nonstop. Internal press took up 3 rows in the back. Cameras were prohibited, but that didn't stop the documentation. Hundreds of eyes tracked every move, each gaze a silent question. Today, whose side will the system choose? The judge was a middle-aged woman, known for sentencing a string of officers for abuse of power in 2015. She didn't dramatize the opening, just struck the gavel, outlined the procedural terms, and moved straight to witness testimony. The first witness was a mid-ranking officer, 18 years in the force, 5 of which were spent working alongside Greg. He wore full uniform, voice hoarse with age, but steady, one that carried weight. When asked about Greg, he didn't hesitate. Always responded quickly, by the book. Greg's legal team gave a small nod, but then the prosecution asked, "During that time, did you ever hear of any internal concerns regarding Greg Harding's conduct exceeding standards?" 4 seconds of silence followed. No interruptions. No objections. Then the officer exhaled quietly. "I heard things, but not enough to conclude anything." That answer, plain, without embellishment, neither defending nor accusing, was the first crack. A crack in a wall once held firm by unit loyalty, internal affairs, and what happens in the house stays in the house. No one in the courtroom reacted openly, but eyes moved. Some tilted heads, some wrote faster, some simply took deeper breaths. No one shouted blame, but the wall had started to fracture. No sledgehammer, no protest chant, just one man on the stand, admitting he had heard, and he could no longer pretend he hadn't. By the 3rd week of the trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer the tense silence of a beginning, but the strained build-up of something about to snap. The name of the next witness, Donald Keener, made heads lift. No one was surprised to hear his name, but his presence on the stand was no longer symbolic. It was a direct strike at the protective wall Greg Harding had once relied on. Donald had been the deputy supervisor for internal affairs in the Western District, Greg's direct superior. He had spoken at law enforcement reform conferences. He had appeared in internal training videos with his well-known quote, "We're always watching to make sure no one crosses the line." And he was the one who had signed off on 3 complaints between 2015 and 2018, all marked "No clear violation found." The file brought forward by the prosecution was one of those cases. A young man detained without clear cause. Jailhouse cameras missing 32 minutes of footage, 27 of which were labeled non-functional due to technical error. But the FBI, after decrypting backup data from the system's hard drive, discovered metadata showing the camera had been manually disabled, its battery removed, with no malfunction. In the courtroom, the prosecutor projected an excerpt from an internal memo. A bold sentence appeared on the screen. "Visual data unclear, noted by Donald Keener." When asked, he did not deny it. He didn't argue, but he offered no legitimate explanation. "I signed off based on the technical reports submitted," he said. "Did you verify it yourself?" "Not directly." His answer had no legal weight, but for the hundreds in the gallery and the millions watching outside, it was an unspoken admission. There had been neglect, if not deliberate shielding. Greg Harding kept his head down. Maya did not move. But from the press benches, the sound of keys typing echoed like battle drums. Donald left the witness stand with steps far less steady than when he had entered. No one watched him walk out. The people who had once shared tables with him at security conferences now avoided eye contact. Some turned away. Some looked down. Outside, the headlines updated by lunchtime. Senior officer implicated in covering for Greg Harding. Case expands beyond expectations. No one inside the system said anything at that moment, but Maya understood. The silence now was not to protect a person. It was to shield a system that could no longer hold its weight. Because when someone with authority, someone who had once signed papers determining others' futures, stood in court unable to meet a steady gaze, it was no longer just about one man being exposed. It was about a layer of power being stripped away by data, by voices, by those once forced into silence. 2 days after the confrontation with Donald Keener, Maya received the first email. No subject line, no sender name, no shocking images or paragraphs. Just one sentence. "You really think you'll live in peace after this?" The message came from an anonymous address, routed through layers of automated redirects. The cybersecurity team tried to trace it, but could only confirm its intentional obfuscation, a cold warning, a silent knock. Maya didn't react right away. She had received threats before, during higher-stakes investigations, but this felt different, not because it was more direct, but because of its timing. The message arrived right after a superior of Greg's had been exposed. She knew that was no coincidence. It was a signal. She wasn't just pressing on Greg Harding. She was pushing into deeper levels of a structure built to suppress resistance. That evening, as Maya left the Federal Investigation Building, she noticed a black car parked across the street. No front license plate. She slowed her pace and watched. The person inside didn't move. As she pretended to check her phone and walked toward it, the engine roared, the car reversed direction and sped away down the wrong side of the road until it disappeared. Maya reported the incident, but the response she received didn't match what she was used to. "Do you have confirmation of the plate?" "No, but I clearly saw it accelerate away when I approached." "Then it may have been a coincidence. I'd like access to the street camera logs." "Sorry, there's no usable footage from that section." She hung up. A familiar feeling washed over her. The sensation of being a victim told there wasn't enough to act on. Except this time, the victim knew exactly who didn't want to act. A day later, a handwritten note arrived at her home. No postage mark, no envelope, just a folded sheet left in her mailbox. Written in thick black marker, "Stay quiet while you still can." This time, Maya didn't report it. She passed it discreetly to a trusted colleague on the special analysis team, then continued her work as usual. But she adjusted her routes, pulled out of public events, reset all her communication passwords. Maya understood better than anyone. This was no longer just about the courtroom. It was no longer a contest between whistleblower and defendant. It was the system's defensive response, one that had long relied on silence to survive. Now, it was fighting back. Not to restore justice, but to extinguish anyone naming the things it had tried so hard to bury. She wasn't afraid, but she was cautious, and more than anything, she wasn't alone anymore. Because every time the darkness tried to move closer, it only revealed something deeper. The light Maya had sparked was beginning to illuminate what no one was ever supposed to see. The sentencing took place on a Monday morning under skies so clear and calm it felt unnatural. No protests, no media crowding the steps. The atmosphere outside the courthouse gave no hint of a landmark ruling, but everyone who stepped into the courtroom that day understood. This was a turning point, quiet but irreversible. Greg Harding sat upright. His suit was no longer new. The fabric at his elbows faded. His gaze was empty, no alertness, no arrogance. Not a single excess motion, just a distant stare, as if trying to see through the wood-paneled walls to find a version of himself he no longer recognized. The attorney beside him said nothing. His final defense statement left blank. The courtroom was so quiet, the sound of a journalist flipping pages echoed like stretching paper. No one moved, no one asked questions. Everyone already knew the verdict from last night's news. But what they came for wasn't the words. It was the sound of a power structure being forced to say aloud what it once denied. The judge was the only one who stood. Her voice didn't punch each word like a televised indictment. No dramatic pauses, no repetitions. She read like reciting a technical brief, but that composure made each syllable drop like metal on tile. The court finds the defendant, Greg Harding, guilty of abuse of authority in the execution of his duty and of severe violation of civil rights against a non-resisting citizen. Penalties include permanent revocation of law enforcement credentials, stripped of federal intervention privileges, 2 years of unpaid community labor at a civil rehabilitation center, and 6 months of behavioral reformation under federal statute 12.3. Greg didn't bow his head. He didn't flinch. No shaking, no blinking, no words. His face was frozen. The room remained still. No one from the public gallery spoke. Those who had defended him were absent. The officials who once shook his hand at conferences, silent. The quiet scrape of a wooden chair at the back was the loudest sound. After the sentence was read, Maya sat in the third row. She didn't nod, didn't sigh in relief. She looked straight at the bench, as if seeing through Greg, not to claim victory, but to witness a system finally forced to name what was right without fear or cover-up. Because some verdicts don't need prison bars to carry weight. Some sentences are just paper, but they make a sound. The system once tried everything to keep silent. As Greg stepped away from the defendant's podium, he didn't turn around. His steps were slow, not dragging, not defiant, like moving through water. Every motion heavier than usual, but without resistance. He didn't ask, "Can I appeal?" Didn't glance at his lawyer for a cue. The process unfolded like a script. But Greg's eyes, perhaps for the first time, were no longer looking for anyone. He expected no one to rise. No ally to nod. The tower of power he once stood atop, gone. And he knew it. He was no longer the center of anything. Not the headline, not the image of law, not even the object of pity. Greg was now only debris, a remnant of a system that once shielded, lied, and chose who could speak and who must remain silent. Maya didn't look at him. She didn't need to. For her, victory wasn't in the lines of a ruling. It was in the moment the room saw that the man who once believed he was the law could no longer define himself. No applause followed. No one stood. No tears. But no one rushed to leave either. Everyone present knew what had just happened wasn't the end of a case. It was the drawing of a new line between a system clinging to privilege and those forcing it to face its own reflection. After the verdict, there was no press conference, but outside the courthouse, Lydia Monroe, the mother whose petition had been denied nearly a decade ago, stood at the entrance, holding a photo of her son as a teenager. She didn't give a long statement, didn't hold a mic. She simply stood before the camera of a local news crew and said one sentence: "Justice isn't when someone is locked up. It's when the one who was right is no longer treated like they were wrong." That quote was replayed on national news. It wasn't paired with dramatic music or cut into highlight reels, but it was shared more widely than the sentence itself, because it wasn't about Greg or Maya. It was about us, the people who had once stayed silent, believing our voices would go nowhere. And that morning, when the verdict was archived, no one closed the file like a trophy. They closed it like an opening chapter, a chapter where the names of victims were no longer shelved under insufficient evidence, where the names of offenders couldn't disappear through internal reassignment, where the system, if it intended to survive, had to learn how to rewrite its own role. Because in that silent hallway, one man had left the defendant's box. But the voice of the public, finally, had not left the conversation, and this time it stayed loud. 3 weeks after the verdict, Greg Harding began his mandatory rehabilitation program at Community Communication Center, known as 909, a facility designated for individuals who had abused authority while on duty. There were no iron bars, no orange jumpsuits, no guard towers or sirens, just a row of corrugated metal buildings tucked deep within a poor neighborhood on the south side of the city, where faded walls, cracked plastic chairs, and a red dirt yard still bore the footprints of those who had never been heard. On his first day, Greg walked in to no greeting. No one looked at him with anger, but no one looked at him like he was new either. Here, names and past ranks were not mentioned. On the registration board, next to the line reading Harding Gregory, was a small tag, Communication Level 1, Passive Group. He was assigned to the Story Listening Group. Every morning, a local resident, someone who had suffered from abuse of authority, someone who had lost a loved one to unlawful detainment, someone who had been beaten without explanation, would sit across from the group and speak for 30 minutes. No debate allowed, no questions asked. The listener's only task was to hear and say nothing. On the first day, Greg sat in the second row. hands gently gripping his knees, eyes fixed on the stained concrete floor. The ceiling fan buzzed softly. A sheet of center rules flapped in the breeze on a window. No one spoke to him. The coordinator nodded and entered. A small black man, his shoulders slightly tilted to one side, stepped forward and took a seat across from Greg. His name was Darnell, 62 years old. No name tag, no script. He simply spoke, each word slow, even, dry. His voice was raspy like falling sand, without emotion, yet carrying years of weight. In 1999, I was arrested while driving my daughter to church. The officers said I was loitering. I asked why, and they gave no answer. They threw me onto the hood, twisted my arms, while my daughter stood on the curb and cried. No one apologized. No one brought it up again. No one cried. No one yelled. But each sentence scraped across memory like a dull blade. His and those in the room listening. Greg did not look up, but his hands relaxed. His eyes flickered. It wasn't the light. When the story ended, there was no applause. Darnell stood, nodded, and walked out without another word. Greg remained seated long after the others had risen. No one rushed him. No one asked him to respond. At the exit, a wooden plaque hung over the door. Greg paused, reading the carved inscription without thinking. Justice does not begin with the law, but with listening to what we once refused to hear. He said nothing, but for the first time, Greg understood. This was not punishment. It was the first time he was forced to sit and listen, not to defend, not to dismiss, just to realize how much his silence had hurt others. In the second week of the program, Greg was required to attend an open dialogue session, the only type of meeting at the center where participants could not choose their seats, could not prepare in advance, and where no line separated the corrected from the heard. Chairs were arranged in a circle. At the center, a microphone, but no one stood to speak. Everyone sat equally. That day, the dialogue group was made up of high school students, mostly students of color, from an inner-city school that had faced 2 confrontations with local police in the last academic year. They were young, but their eyes carried no softness. Each brought a story that needed no editing to be legitimate. Greg sat in that circle, no desk, no uniform, no handcuffs, but no power either. Just a middle-aged man facing the things he once handled through paperwork. As a girl across from him, long braids, a faint scar running from her temple to her left cheek, spoke in a calm tone. "Did you ever think we were afraid?" Greg didn't answer. He stared at the floor. The girl didn't wait for a response. "It's okay. I just want you to know this. The silence when we're being humiliated hurts more than the threats. Because when someone yells in your face, at least you know how to react. But when they're just silent, you don't even know if you're still a person." No one clapped. No one cross-examined. But in that moment, the room wasn't a rehabilitation center anymore. It was a courtroom. One where the verdict required no gavel, only truths no one bothered to hide. Greg didn't reply. He wasn't allowed to, but he didn't need to. When the session ended, he didn't leave like he usually did. He stayed a few minutes longer, then stood, walked to the manager's office, and requested an extra evening shift, cleaning duty in restroom block A. No one had asked. No one had scheduled him. The manager asked, "Are you sure that shift's dirty and long?" Greg answered simply, "At least there I can do something," without speaking. No one was sure Greg would change. No one rushed to believe he had repented, but people began to notice that in the following story sessions, he no longer sat hunched. He no longer looked down. He no longer avoided eye contact. He began to look at the person speaking. No interruptions, no bowed head, just attention. No one asked him to apologize. No one expected confessions. But one thing was clear. The very things that had once diminished others, his silence, his disregard, his institutional gaze, were now being unlearned. The only way this center taught, by sitting down and listening. And that, more than anything else, was something he had never done while wearing a badge, because back then he had been trained to command. But now he was learning to be human, taught by the very people he once viewed as footnotes in his reports. News of Greg Harding's mandatory rehabilitation didn't make headlines, but it spread through old law enforcement circles faster than any news broadcasts. Not through media, not through official reports, but through blurry screenshots, brief video clips of Greg sitting in a group dialogue with high school students, leaked into a closed online forum for former officers who had served in the western counties. An anonymous user, just a string of numbers and the initials of an old precinct, posted one line: "He used to be one of us. Now he's sitting there letting kids call him out. Doesn't matter what the sentence says. He's done." No one confirmed the author, but Greg didn't need to. He felt the effect almost immediately. A message from the former partner who once saved him from an internal report, left unanswered. A coffee invite from an old friend, declined with, "I'm on assignment." A familiar number, straight to voicemail. Greg wasn't angry, wasn't surprised, but this time it felt different. He'd been accused before, questioned. But there was always someone to defend him, always a hand inside the system, ready to say he followed protocol. This time, nothing. No one wanted to touch it, not because they believed he was wrong, but because they were afraid if they stood too close, the light shining on him might shine on them. One night, Greg returned to the halfway housing for those undergoing rehab. The room was basic: metal-framed bed, wooden desk, a dim yellow lamp. On the wall hung a worn chalkboard with faded handwriting. "Everyone has erred. No one should stay wrong forever." On the desk, a small package, no sender's name, just Harding, scrawled in black marker. Inside was a cheap plastic toy handcuff, the kind made for kids, along with a sticky note. "Try it on again, but this time, no one's getting you out." Greg set the note down. No rage, no trembling. He just sat there for a long time, not looking at the toy, staring at the dull space between the wall and window, where a sliver of streetlight cut through the blinds like a silent wound. At that moment, he wasn't thinking about betrayal or injustice. He was replaying every time he stood by, when a colleague pushed someone too hard, when a recording glitched, when someone asked, "You think this is okay?" and he just shrugged. Greg used to believe silence was neutrality, that as long as he didn't directly do harm, he was still clean. But in that dim room, with a fake cuff and no more backup, he understood for the first time, silence is a choice, and sometimes it's the worst one. That night Greg didn't sleep, not out of fear, not from regret, but because an image kept playing over and over in his mind, like a tape without a stop button. The face of the girl from the school session. Long braids, eyes that didn't accuse, just a faint scar tracing her cheek, and a quiet question. "Do you think we're scared of you?" There was no hate in her eyes, and that made it heavier, because she wasn't asking him to answer. She didn't need him to apologize. She just needed him to remember. And Greg realized he had been part of that fear, not with batons or threats, but with indifference, with silence. The dim light cast over his rehab file. Greg flipped to the final page, personal statement for early review. The space was blank, a small box meant for words if he ever felt he had been honest enough to ask for a shortened sentence. He didn't write, he just stared for a long time. Outside, the insects buzzed dully. A few street lamps flickered, nothing unusual. But inside, Greg sat back against the wall, arms folded over his chest, as if holding himself together. Around 3 a.m., someone in the next room heard quiet sniffling, not sobs, not gasps, not sudden, just the sound of a man finally allowing himself to face what he had always dodged. That he wasn't cast out by betrayal. He was cast out because he had betrayed trust, duty, and the last human part of himself. Greg didn't cry because he was discarded. He cried because for the first time, he saw how small he truly was, when it had really mattered, and he had done nothing. No one came in to comfort him. No one patted his back. No one said, "It's going to be okay." No one needed to. The next morning, before sunrise, Greg was the first to show up for the early kitchen shift. No reminders, no orders, sleeves rolled up, no clipboard, no clock checking. He didn't walk slowly like usual, but not hurried either. just straight to the place where someone was needed to scrub the floor, and started there. A supervisor passing by asked softly, "You're early?" Greg nodded. No excuses, no explanations. When he got to the back doorway, he paused, not out of fatigue, but because he heard a voice in his head, not sure whose, but familiar, and for the first time he whispered to himself, "I can't fix the past, but I can sit up front. When someone else tells the truth, I once pretended not to see." At the 13th dialogue session at the Center for Restorative Communication, Greg no longer sat in the back like he usually did. That day, he was invited to the inner circle, where there was no longer a distinction between speaker and listener. For the first time since the program began, Greg agreed to speak, not to please the counselor, not to boost his progress report, and not because anyone forced him. He spoke because he had finally understood. The silence that once protected him was the same silence that had stolen the voices of so many others. Across from him sat a group of 11th grade students from an inner-city high school. No microphone, no script, no moderator. Some wore dark hoodies, slouched low with hands in their pockets. Others scribbled notes, hands trembling like preparing for a debate. But when Greg began to speak, all of them looked up. Not out of curiosity, but because it was rare to see someone who once embodied power sit down in front of them, unshielded, without armor. I used to believe I was maintaining order, keeping people safe, doing what was right. His voice wasn't shaky. It wasn't flat either, but it was the voice of someone who could no longer control the narrative the way he once did. He spoke each word carefully, as if returning the stories he had once erased from internal reports. A kid in the middle row, worn jacket, dark eyes, asked bluntly, not rudely, "Did you used to hate us?" The room fell silent. A facilitator shifted forward, as if ready to intervene, but Greg raised his hand, not to stop others, but as if steadying himself from the instinct to dodge. He didn't answer right away. His eyes dropped to the floor for a moment before lifting again. "No, I just didn't think at all. I didn't think about why you were scared. I didn't think about why you were scared. I didn't think about why you were scared. I didn't think about what I was doing. And that was the first mistake?" A few students nodded. Another bit their lip. The guarded looks were gone. No one pulled out a phone. No one scoffed. There was no longer a gap between the one who used to give orders and the ones who used to endure them. Greg kept speaking. No phrases like job pressure, no excuses like "I had no choice." He spoke slowly, steadily, about the time he didn't stop a colleague from shoving a boy into a fence just for running the wrong way, about when he knew someone had altered a report and he stayed silent because it wouldn't change anything, about the last time someone asked him, "Do you think that was right?" And he just shrugged. I thought I was staying neutral, but really, staying out of it was standing on the wrong side. There was no applause, no praise, but the silence in that room was different, not tense, but the kind of quiet that happens when someone finally says something others have only dared to think. When the session ended, Greg stood and gave a slight bow, not deep, not asking for forgiveness or recognition, just the gesture of someone who knew. Today he stopped blaming and stood on his own feet without a badge. Greg didn't leave right away. He didn't avoid eye contact or rush out like others before him. A few students, just a handful, approached. No one asked for a photo. No one patted him on the back or said, "You'll be okay." They simply exchanged words, as if testing whether what Greg had said was real, not with logic, but with instinct. One kid, the youngest looking, frizzy hair, backpack hanging off one shoulder, looked at Greg for a few seconds before quietly saying, "I didn't think you'd be real with us. I thought you'd blame it on job stress." Greg didn't respond right away. He just looked at the kid, then smiled. Not a relieved smile, but one without defense, without spin. Back then, I probably would have. I would have said, "It's just the job," or "I was following orders." But after all this time, if I'm still blaming, then I'm just trying to protect the shadow I used to be afraid to face. No one said more, but the look in that kid's eyes and those standing nearby softened, not because they forgave him, but because they no longer had to fight someone clinging to a mask. A few longtime staff at the center stood at a distance, watching. One whispered, "He's changed." Not because Greg had said the right things, but because he had stopped trying to manage other people's reactions. He wasn't speaking to be pardoned, he was speaking to admit. That afternoon, Greg was invited to write in the center's guest book, a large ledger reserved for those who no longer had to report their progress. Each person was given one page. No prompts, just space for a message, a note, or simply a name. Greg sat in front of the blank sheet, holding a sharpened pencil. He didn't write immediately. He sat there, back slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the white space like he was retracing every step that led him there. Then he wrote. No cross-outs, no polished phrasing, just 4 straight lines. I used to be someone who saw no one but myself. Now I look at others, not to control, but to understand. I don't wait to be forgiven. I just don't want to stay silent anymore. He didn't sign his name. No drawing, no date, but the staff member responsible for the book later said, Greg was the first to write without asking, "What should I say to get it right?" When he left, Greg didn't look back at the page. He just set the pencil down and nodded at the manager, not as a goodbye, but as a quiet vow. Because for him, in that moment, taking responsibility no longer meant bowing his head. It meant standing tall, in front of the mirror, in front of others, and in front of himself. The Justice Reform Forum wasn't held in a grand hall nor sponsored by big-name institutions. It took place in an old community center on the city's edge, where those who once worked within the system and those harmed by it could share a room, without name tags, without live-stream cameras, and without the pressure to reconcile. No red carpet, no stage, just a ring of plastic chairs and a makeshift wooden podium, so worn that one leg was propped up with a folded scrap of paper. Maya was there at the invitation of a civic group she had worked with since that trial. She came alone. No assistant. She arrived on time and quietly sat in the 3rd row beside an elderly woman and a curly-haired student taking notes in pencil. Maya's face showed little change. Same alert eyes, same straight back, never resting on the chair. No one recognized her. No one had to. Greg arrived later. No host announced him, no spotlight followed him. He wore a light gray shirt and dark trousers. No badge, no symbols of who he used to be. But Maya recognized him, not by his walk, but by the unusual quiet surrounding him. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was the space people instinctively give someone who's about to stand up, not to argue, but to take responsibility. They didn't talk, didn't approach, didn't hold each other's gaze for more than a second, but neither did they turn away. In the brief moment their eyes passed, something flickered. Not forgiveness, not sympathy, just a quiet acknowledgement. We are here, exactly where the system never imagined we could be. One of the organizers greeted Greg and gestured toward the last row. He nodded in thanks and sat down without a sound. Maya didn't glance over, but she knew the motions, because she had once sat like that, in that year, at another hearing where she didn't speak to win, but to survive. No applause marked the beginning of the forum. People hadn't come for catharsis. They came to listen, and in that stillness, Greg was neither called out nor ignored. His presence simply was a sign that the journey had been long enough that, at the very least, he showed up. There was no handshake. No one said, "I'm sorry." No need for, "I regret that." Both Maya and Greg understood if anything needed to happen, it wouldn't be in the form of ceremony. No symbolic nods, no forced handshakes to patch over what was already too visible. What mattered was stability of position. Who was listening, who had learned not to interrupt another's story, and who had learned that sometimes just showing up at the right time is enough. Years ago, Greg would have entered a room expecting control. Today, he came as part of a chain of people who had learned to stop hiding. And Maya, the one he once stood opposite on the edge of justice, sat silent like a witness, no longer there to remember but to confirm. Some changes don't need to be declared. No tears, no dramatics, just the act of sitting without leaving. When Greg was invited to speak, no one in the room expected anything. No phones were raised, No one leaned in, waiting for an apology. No one hoped for a redemption arc. The moderator introduced him plainly, without emphasis on the past. Someone who was once on the other side of the story, now choosing to stay, not to repeat it. The words carried no emotion, but they triggered a brief hush, as if everyone straightened up, sensing something was about to unfold. Not loud, but weighty. Greg stepped onto the scuffed podium. No notes, no slides. Light from a nearby window streaked across the table where he rested his hands. He stood still for a long time, longer than those trained to speak immediately would, but this time he wasn't there to explain. He simply looked around and said, "I'm not here to fix what was wrong. I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again." That was all. No extra words. No trembling voice, no rhetorical flourishes, and because of that, the words didn't feel like a performance. There was no applause, no coughs, just quiet, not a silence for reacting, not a silence for dissecting, but one where every pause and word seemed to be held gently, as if to weigh whether a man had truly changed or was just playing the part. Maya looked too. No nod, no notes, but her eyes, for the first time in years, weren't searching for fault. They measured, in the way only someone who has endured can. Does this man know who he is now? And if so, does he have the courage, not to beg, not to explain, but to simply stand? Greg left the podium. No bow, no show of humility. He returned to his seat in the back row. No one followed his movement, but something shifted quietly in the room. His presence, even wordless, had changed the air. Not because of what he said, but because of what he chose. To show up, say enough, then step back. In the right role, at the right time. That forum, according to the organizer, had no climax, no tears, no shouting. But in the moderator's notebook, one line was underlined in green ink. Two people once on opposite sides of a collision, now able to share a room. Not to forgive, but to stop more harm. And that, more than any post-forum report, was what mattered most. Not reconciliation, not surprise, just a moment quiet enough that no one felt the need to fight for space to speak. And the forum ended, no one stood up first. No facilitator made a closing statement. There was no applause, no background music like at major conferences, just a quiet stream of people slowly rising from their seats. Not rushed, not weary, as if they were leaving a conversation that needed no formal conclusion. Maya did not stand right away. She waited until the 2 rows ahead of her began to move, then closed her notebook, the only thing she had brought besides her phone, and placed it in her bag. She did not check it again. She did not look around to see who remained. No one approached her for a word. No one asked for her thoughts. And most importantly, no one needed to. Maya stepped through the old wooden doors of the hall, where the frame had warped slightly on its hinges but still creaked reliably, like a quiet reminder that things long worn could still function. She didn't glance back at the room. She wasn't deep in thought. She didn't hurry as if escaping, nor did she slow, as if waiting for someone to catch up. Her steps were steady and deliberate, just like when she entered a courtroom, a hearing room, or a crime scene. Not to impose, not to be seen, but to be present. Outside, the sky had turned a pale gray. The wind brushed past, just enough to stir her light jacket. A few small groups stood near the trees by the parking lot, still murmuring quietly, their eyes holding fragments of what had just passed. But no one turned to look. No one noticed Maya walk by, and Maya wasn't bothered by that. She had not come to be seen. She had not spoken, not sat in the front row, not been listed among the keynote guests. She had come only to be part of something shifting, something moving, from anger to building, from shouting to listening, from confrontation to presence. At the edge of the exit path, Maya paused for a few seconds, not to wait for a ride, but to feel the wind and her own heartbeat, no longer tight, no longer guarded, no longer holding up a defense. In the space she had just left, she hadn't needed to prove she was right, and no one had to be wrong for her to be believed. Her presence in that room had been the clearest message. Sometimes justice does not arrive through verdicts, but through making sure no one is pushed out of the conversation just because they were once a victim. She turned toward the small road that led out to the main avenue. She didn't wave goodbye, she didn't pass into any camera frame, but on her face, the wind could not erase the calm that only belongs to those who know exactly where they stand and why. Maya didn't return home immediately after leaving the hall. She walked along the row of community buildings, where the walls still bore water stains from seasons past, where the glass windows shimmered in the afternoon sun, but inside the rooms remained simple. Empty meeting spaces with slow-turning ceiling fans. She didn't need to check the time. There were no urgent tasks, no waiting calls, no unread emails, mainly herself and the silence after a day that should have ended years ago, but today was finally called by its name. The wind stirred the small trees near the courtyard. Maya stopped beside a concrete bench with no backrest, placed under the modest shade of a young African mahogany tree. She didn't sit. She simply placed her hand on the bench's edge and looked toward the narrow road leading out to the boulevard. No traffic noise, no clouds of dust, just an unusually peaceful afternoon for this city, and in that moment Maya did not feel she had attended a forum. She did not feel she had completed a mission. She only knew she had kept a promise to herself to be present wherever someone needed to be heard. She thought about Greg, not as someone who had abused his authority, not as the man who once forced her out of a car on an early morning, but as a person who, at last, had come to understand who he was, not through protection, but by daring to admit his wrongs without being forced. And Maya understood that no one is required to forgive, but everyone needs a space in which not to repeat. Today, she had sat in such a space, and if tomorrow someone else needed someone to sit in that third chair the way she once had, Maya would return, not to tell her story, but to allow someone else to tell theirs. Before leaving the community center grounds, she looked up at the wooden sign on the gate, the one with no founders' names printed on it, the one where sponsors were listed by coded identifiers rather than logos. There was nothing ostentatious, no name of Maya, and that made her feel light, because if the story of today were ever written down, it wouldn't need her name at the end. It would only need room for whoever speaks next. She turned into the narrow side path, her shadow stretching across the old brick floor, and when the rear door closed behind her, she heard no lock click, no sharp slam, because that door had not closed. It was only waiting for the next person to step through, someone who needed to speak, or simply to be heard, without fear. Because some stories don't need to end with a period. They only need to be continued at the right time, by the right voice, and in a silence deep enough to listen. The story of Maya and Greg, between an agent who once endured abuse of power and an officer who believed himself untouchable, is not just a clash between two individuals. It is a mirror reflecting deeper societal issues: unconscious bias, power used for the wrong reasons, and silence once mistaken as the safe option. But if there's one truth that threads through every part of their journey, from a moment of humiliation in a public park to the courtroom, the rehabilitation center, and the final community forum, it is this: justice doesn't belong to the loudest voice, but to the one who refuses to walk away when everyone else already has. The first lesson is this: don't judge someone based on appearances, circumstances, or inherited biases. Greg once saw Maya as just a black woman jogging in a neighborhood he considered his, and because of that perception, he acted out of arrogance and ignorance. But when Maya stood her ground, not in rage, but in clarity, she didn't just defend herself. She shook the very system that once disregarded her. It was that composure, that clarity in her eyes, that changed more than the outcome of a trial. It shifted how a community viewed the meaning of power. The second lesson is this: talent and human worth cannot be diminished, no matter where someone comes from, what skin they live in, or what role they play in society. Maya didn't need to raise her voice to prove who she was. She didn't list her credentials or shout her achievements. A single badge, shown at the right moment not to threaten, but to remind, was enough for Greg to realize he had just crossed an irreversible line. And Greg, the man who once thought he'd never have to answer for anything, was forced to learn how to be human again, not through lectures, but through eyes questions, and the unrelenting silence of someone who had once been the victim. And finally, justice always finds a way. But not always through verdicts, prisons, or formal sentences. Sometimes, justice is a person stepping back into the room they were once pushed out of. It's in how they don't need an apology to forgive, and don't need applause to keep going. Maya didn't walk away as a victor. Greg didn't speak like a man redeemed. But both, through their presence in the right moment in the right way, opened a new chapter, where justice is no longer something weighed on a scale, but something chosen in whether or not we repeat the past. This story isn't just about Maya or Greg, it's about all of us. Those who've ever been misjudged by someone who never truly saw us. Those who were underestimated, ignored, dismissed, and yet quietly proved stronger, smarter, and more right than anyone assumed. You may not be an agent. You may not be an officer, but maybe you've been seen the wrong way. Maybe you've been treated unfairly. Maybe someone tried to silence you because they thought you wouldn't speak up. And if that's ever happened to you, then this story is for you. Not to teach you how to forgive, not to make anyone bow their head, but to remind you, you have the right to tell your side of the story. You have the right to walk into a room no one thought you'd dare return to. And you can do it without yelling, without asking permission, just by standing tall. Have you ever been misjudged by someone who didn't really understand you? Have you ever been overlooked but proved yourself better than they expected? If this story made you think, share it so others can reflect too. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, stories that carry more than inspiration. Because every small act, a share, a listen, can be the start of something bigger than we imagine.